Pico, what a delight to have you here with us in JLF Suneva Fushi. In your most recent book, The Half-Flown Life in Search of Paradise, you say, and the reason I'm looking at this is because I'm going on quoting from him, also because I can't do anything without a piece of paper in front of me. I can't live without that. After years of travel, I'd begun to wonder what sort of paradise can be found in a world of unceasing conflict. Tell us about your search for paradise.
Well, it was very much a pandemic book. I mentioned briefly yesterday that literally 20 hours after lockdown was announced in California in March 2020, my poor mother, who's then 88, was rushed into the hospital in an ambulance, losing blood at a scary rate. And so I had to take 3 flights through these eerily deserted ghost town airports to be with her from our little apartment in Japan. And like everybody in the world, as I was sitting by my mother for the next 6.5 months, I was feeling death, breathing down my neck and around the corner. And I think, like everybody else, I was thinking, how can we find hope and light in the middle of life and in the face of death? Because I figure life is always going to be difficult, death is always going to be non-negotiable, but none of that precludes inspiration and possibility and joy, in fact. And also, sitting 6.5 months in one place, as I usually don't get to do, allowed me to think back on 48 years of constant travel. And I started to think, as most travelers do, about the paradise places I'd been. And I've been lucky enough to go to many of the places that you see in the travel agents' posters: Bali, Tahiti, the Seychelles, and probably most radiantly of all, right here. I mean, this is as good as it could get. And yet, my sense is that as all of us here spent 4 days in the sunshine, eating to repletion, getting to enjoy these wonderful conversations, it's absolute paradise for us. But for all the hosts that we see, and I see sweeping the beach at 6 in the morning, it's hard work. It's real life. It's not paradise for them. And if I did find myself in paradise, my thought would be the only effect I could have on it is corruption. If I'm in a perfect place, I'm a very imperfect person. So I'm the snake in the garden, really. And this is, I suppose, the first book where I've written a lot about South Asia. 5 of the 10 chapters are set here. And I was remembering how when I go to Ladakh, where many of you have probably been, and it seems so protected from time, so pristine in its way, so self-contained, you know it better than I do, I'll often say, this is Shangri-La. And a Ladakhi will rightly say to me, forget it, the real Shangri-La is New York City or Santa Monica, all the places that have modernity, affluence, cutting-edge fashions that are less known in Ladakh. At one point I was in Kashmir, not far away, and most of you again will have been there, and I was staying for the first time ever on a houseboat. And right outside my window was a lotus pond. And for hours on end, it's just the whir of kingfisher's wings, nothing else. And people, as you know, paddling past in little boats, selling those exquisite carved boxes and aromatic spices. And in the evenings, I'd sit on the sun deck eating delicious Thai curries and listening to Sufi songs. It was heaven on earth, as long as I didn't remember that 10 minutes across the water was a violent occupation. 600,000 people trying to keep the uneasy peace between, in a region claimed by 2 competing nations for 70 years. And as soon as I got out of the boat, it would be armed, tanks, encampments, barbed wire, and protests. And I think the challenge with Kashmir often is it's so seductive. The sorrow of Kashmir is it's so paradisal, as with Sri Lanka on the other side of India, which for centuries has been known as the island of gems and the island of spices, and therefore the Portuguese came, the Dutch came, the British came, and now millions of us tourists come to just try to get a piece of the treasure and take paradise home with us. As we were walking along the beach this morning, my wife Hiroko began to pick up a stone. She said, no, this belongs here. This is paradise, and who knows what would happen if I take it back to fallen Japan. And so I suppose I came to think that the only paradise I could trust would be one right in the middle of chaos and human uncertainty. And I remember once I was standing along the Ghats in Varanasi, And even though I'm of Hindu origin and 100% Indian, I just didn't know what to make. I'm freaked out by Varanasi and the flames burning on either side of me and the bodies floating past. And as I was standing there, I heard somebody call my name, and it was two Tibetan monks I know, an elderly Tibetan Lama and a young American who's the first Westerner in history to be named the abbot of a Tibetan Buddhist temple in South India by the Dalai Lama. And I'd last seen him along Fifth Avenue in New York, and my American friend came up to me. He looked across this scene of kind of Hieronymus Bosch psychedelia, and he said, "Isn't this glorious? This is the whole thing. It's birth and death and everything in between. This is the reality we have to embrace. Really, this is the only paradise we'll ever find." And I suppose I think that it's notions of paradise that get in the way of finding paradise, and that the only one we could really believe in is this moment. Sorry, long answer.
Good answer, a very good answer for all of us to situate ourselves who are here in sort of paradise. Now, you're a very profound philosophical writer. At the same time, you're very funny and you're very, very prolific. And so many books. I mean, there's Video Nights in Kathmandu and the latest, In Search of Paradise. It's an intrusive question, but which is your favorite book and why?
Well, thank you. You're generous, Namita. You've written many more books than I. You've written more than 20 books, so that's probably more than many of us combined. And I've been out by myself as a self-employed freelance writer since 1986, so I have to keep writing just to pay the bills. And if I stop, my family would be out on the street. But I wonder if you have the same experience. If you ask a filmmaker or writer or anybody, probably the one closest to our hearts is the one least popular with the world. Yes?
It happens.
You know that? Maybe because we put so much of our hearts into it that we haven't found a way to translate it to everybody outside us. So probably my favorite book among mine is far and away my least popular, which is a novel about the dance between Islam and the West called Abandon, which I actually delivered to my agent on September 10th, 2001. And it's my favorite because I really threw my heart into it, and it's everybody else's most despised book because I don't know how to write a novel. The main characters are very disagreeable. And Sufism is something that's hard for any of us to catch, maybe especially if we're outside the tradition. But I think because I've done a lot of non-fiction, non-fiction to me feels like almost I can do it with my eyes closed walking around the block. Whereas fiction, of which I've done very little, feels like driving out into the desert after dark with the headlights out. And you don't know what's going to come out. And more scarily, whatever comes out is something inside you. The monsters in the darkness are all essentially demons within oneself. I suppose the other thing I would say is maybe the book of mine that readers seem to like is one from 35 years ago called The Lady and the Monk, my second book. And when I read it now, half of me winces because I was a bratty know-it-all, barely out of my 20s when I wrote it. But the other half is really grateful that I commemorated in prose my first year in Japan and my discovery of the country and the person and the lifestyle that I hope will be mine forever. And again, I'm sure you find this. When I go back and look at that book, so many of the most essential formative moments in my life I completely forgot, and I wouldn't even believe existed, except there I do have the impersonal, impartial record that it really did. And so I'm grateful to writing for making solid what would otherwise flit out of one's memory very quickly.
I think a lot of us in the audience and here on stage will get a hold of your fiction. And here's to your next book of fiction.
Really, I feel it would be an indulgence. I would enjoy it because it's a great adventure for me.
That's a good enough thing with all your live in the present, be still.
Yes, but when it comes to paying the bills, it's a less alluring proposition.
I think we will wait for the fiction. So here we are in the lap of the Indian Ocean. Let's talk about islands. There was a book review. Now, those of you in the audience who are impatient with long questions, it makes sense in the end, this long question which I'll read out. There was a book review you wrote perhaps in 1999 of Ramesh Gunasekara's novel Reef. It is set in Sri Lanka. It's about a chef and a marine biologist obsessed by seafood. Well, here we have an island not too far from Sri Lankan chefs, and seafood, and there are marine biologists around who had a session actually as well. In your review of Reef, titled The Empire Strikes Back, another familiar title, you begin by talking about Shakespeare's The Tempest as a model for post-colonial fiction, which, yes. And then there's the essay on Bali, titled On Prospero's Isle. And Gunasekara's novel too begins with an epigraph from The Tempest. In the introduction, the author writes, that's Ramesh Gunasekara, the real beauty of a coral reef is in the way it renews itself and creates the strongest of structures with the most delicate of life forms. A bit like writing fiction, maybe. So tell us about islands, coral reefs, and The Tempest in any order you want.
That's the most amazing question. I mean, it deserves to be long because there's so much going on. And thank you for, there's a whole sort of doctoral thesis there about the thesis, Gunasekara, and my first book. Thank you. And it's so interesting that you mentioned that chapter on Bali because that was the first chapter in my first book from 38 years ago. And it was all about paradise, which shows that we think we're running away from one of our central themes, but it stays with us and follows us even if we try to get away from it. And it was about how can you possibly put tourists and paradise into the same sentence or into the same reality. And, I mean, it actually takes us back to our first question, because I remember in 1984, I was living in New York City, and I was in the middle of a sort of torrential midwinter day, and I got into a plane, and I flew through a day and a night and another day, and I arrived in Bali. And my first morning, many of you will have experienced this, I was sitting in the little terrace of my cottage. A man with a beautiful smile came and brought me fresh mangoes and wonderful strong tea. All around, there were these children with angel faces playing. And I was paying $2 a night for the whole cottage to myself. Down a sandy lane, fringed with palms, just 45 seconds away was this golden beach, not as beautiful as that, but pretty close. And I thought, my gosh, this really is heaven on earth. One day before, I'd been in the turmoil of 50th Street, suddenly I was in tropical sunshine. But probably you find this even in the Maldives, the sunniest place has a nighttime. And a few hours later, darkness fell. I heard the wild dogs barking behind me, and the sound of the gamelan, which to me is so dissonant and spooky and unsettling. And those boys with angel faces were performing a dance in which they were reenacting the battle of light and dark from the Ramayana and stabbing themselves, replicating mass suicide. And those little girls with angel faces were dancing under a trance. And I suddenly realized I've got into something much deeper than I begin to understand. And for a few hours of sunlight, and I can revel in it, but really this is about forces far larger than myself that I couldn't begin to contain. And some of you will remember, if you went to Bali in the 1980s, along the dusty lanes of Kuta, they would sell masks along the shops, and you'd see bird-headed gods and demons and all kinds of very potent figures. And I realized that those were much too powerful for me to tamper with. But finally I found a little mask of an owl, brightly colored, sort of ideal for a present for a little godchild. So I bought my owl mask, I took it back to New York City, and I eagerly put it up on the wall. And within 10 seconds, I had to tear it down and put it away and never look at it again. It was like maybe the stone Hiroko might have picked up on this beach. There's something so charged and strong in that. And anyone who's read about the violence in Bali in 1965 knows about that shadow side. But I did, 2 years before I arrived in Bali, I'd been teaching Shakespeare in Boston. And it was hard not to think this is the island of Caliban and Ariel and imported treachery from Milan. And really, to a startling degree, the island is full of sweet airs and noises or whatever Shakespeare says. That's what was happening around me. And so when I came upon Ramesh's novel, I think his second novel, 10 years later, was it? It's a remarkable novel. And I seized upon that quotation for The Tempest, wondering whether Ariel or Caliban would take control of Prospero's island. I shouldn't talk about coral reefs and marine biologists, because as you said, we have experts to talk about them. But Bali still stays in my mind. I've been back 4 times. I've never come to terms with it. I think it's just too magical a place for me. And any visitor can't really read the signs or understand the forces at play. Which is maybe a feature of an external paradise.
No, of course, the black magic, the Hindu tantric rituals are very strong in Natsadua and some of those beaches. And transformed with Indonesian ways. Tell us of your home in Nara with your partner Hiroko, who's somewhere sitting there patiently listening, and what Japan means to you, and also all the other homes, the temporary homes, the longer staying homes that you've known, that you relate to, continue to inhabit somewhere in your books, in your memories, and in your travels.
Yes, well, that's another long and complicated question. I'll break it up into two parts, and first talk about Japan and then home. And I think, for me, the interesting thing when I think about my 36 years in Japan is that the reason I moved there is that while I was living in New York City, I had a business trip in Hong Kong, and flying back, I had a 20-hour layover at Narita Airport near Tokyo. And all I wanted to do was be back in New York and see all my friends again and talk about Hong Kong. But there I was stuck in Narita. And I woke up in the morning, and I still had 6 hours to kill, and I thought, I'll never be in Japan again. What am I going to do? An airport town is not the most glamorous place on earth. Anyone who's been to Hounslow or Queens or Inglewood knows that. I saw a little sign saying free shuttle bus. So I thought, I might as well see this town. I got into the bus. We drove through these busy urban streets, high concrete buildings. We came to a bridge, and I got out. I walked across the bridge, and suddenly I was in these very narrow streets, all wooden houses, shoes laid out tidily at their entrance, the flash of orange and gold through the back windows, the first tinge of autumn. And I followed this riddle of streets to a 1,000-year-old temple, big white pebble courtyard. I'd never seen anything like that before. Sat in the temple for a while, walked around it, and I came to a park where there were a lot of little children, about 6 years old, with pink and blue caps, scattering around, gathering autumn leaves. And something about that scene struck me as so familiar, and went so deep inside me. I thought, this is where I belong. This place understands me, I understand it, and if I don't come back, something in my life will always be unresolved. I'll be an exile for the rest of my life. So by the time I boarded the plane, 2 hours later, I decided to move to Japan. And it took me 3 years to extricate myself from my job, but finally I got there, and ever since I've been in Japan, I've never thought about anywhere else. And I say that because I think home, like love, is a matter of intuition. I could give you lots of reasons why Japan feels like home, but I wouldn't really believe in it. It's the way you meet a stranger and you feel as if you've known her forever. And it also, rather wonderfully, now I think of it, reminds me that home and belonging really are not necessarily connected. I mean, I feel I belong very fully to England, where I spent my first 21 years. I'd never want to live there, maybe because I belong to it too fully. In Japan, I will never belong, but I feel deep down that's exactly where I have to spend all my days. And the Japanese, as you know, because you've been spending time longer than I, have very strong demarcations of who's an outsider and who's an insider. And so long as you acknowledge those, it's a perfect place to be a foreigner. And I think when I was a little boy, growing up to Indian parents in England, moving to California when I was 7, I thought how lucky I am that home is a collage. And I've been given 3 sets of eyes, and I can mix them and match them. And when I come to the Maldives, I'm not seeing them as a typical Indian might, if there's such a thing as a typical Indian, or as an English person, or as a Californian, but bringing various perspectives to bear to a very various place. And I never guessed then that what seemed like a blessing to me at that time is now the norm. If you go to a classroom in any big city, Sydney, Toronto, Paris, London, San Francisco, the kids in the classrooms are much more many-homed than I am. And home has almost become a sentence that we keep adding things to. So Japan is a deep home to me, but when I was young, Thailand and Tibet threw open doors inside me that might otherwise have been closed. I spent a lot of time in Cuba, and that released emotions in me that no other place could have. Such as, well, Cuba's a place of passion. I'm a fairly restrained person, and Cuba is way out there. Everything is happening on the streets. So it called me to be somebody different than I might be, especially in Japan. Cuba's probably the diametrical opposite. And, I'd always had this sense that home is not where you live, it's what lives inside you. But then, I think I mentioned it yesterday, I was in my family house in California once, and I saw this distant knife of orange cutting through a hillside, and I went to call the fire department. When I came upstairs again, we were surrounded by 70-foot flames, 5 stories high, and by the end of that evening, it wiped out our house and every last possession we had in the world. So literally, the next morning, if somebody had said, "Where's your home?" I couldn't point to any physical construction. It had to be what I carried inside me, my wife to be, my mother, the song that's going through in my head, the Graham Greene book I always keep reading. And I think young people today very much appreciate that home is not connected to a piece of soil. It's really a piece of soul, and it's a mobile thing that you carry with you as a snail might.
So, in fact, all the things you've said reminds me of the line in The Man Within My Head, where you say, home lies in the things you carry with you everywhere, not the ones that tie you down.
That's a perfect transition. Beautiful, yes. Not the things that, the things that liberate you, I suppose.
You wrote that, not me.
I did, but when you hear your own words read by somebody else, that actually opens new windows.
In the book, The Man Within My Head, Pico writes, home lies in the things you carry with you everywhere, and not the ones that tie you down.
And I like that, because hearing you read that, I realize it's got to do with liberation rather than enclosure, and maybe that's what I sensed in Japan. It would be open me up to some destiny that would otherwise be dormant, and I didn't feel I could do that in England in the same way.
So in your session yesterday, you talked also about the Dalai Lama, but I'm sure you have things to say. You've had a long friendship with the 14th Dalai Lama. Your book, The Open Road, is beautifully written, mindful, meditative account of the Dalai Lama's very unique life journey. Tell us more about your deep friendship with this revered figure.
Again, I mean, too much to say, but when the Dalai Lama fled into exile in India in 1959, we were living in Oxford, and I was a little boy, and every morning we'd hear on the radio, through the static and the crackle, this report that seemed to me like a fairy tale of a young boy king fleeing over the highest mountains on earth to try to get to freedom, being pursued by planes. And my father was a philosopher and actually knew a lot about Buddhism, and so I think was one of the relatively few people at that time who realized for the first time in history this great repository of wisdom was available to the outside world. So my father sailed all the way back to India and requested an audience with the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama, arriving in exile, was very keen to talk to as many people as possible. So they had this long conversation. At the end of it, my father said, I've got this 2-year-old, 3-year-old boy back in England who is very taken up with the story of your flight. And the Dalai Lama's gift, one of them, is to find common ground with anybody. So he found this little picture of him when he was 4 years old, already sitting on the lion throne of Lhasa, ruling 13 million Tibetan Buddhists and 6 million Tibetans. And he sent it to me through my father. And I put it on my desk, and I can really remember when I was growing up, if ever I was sort of feeling sorry for myself, I just looked at this picture. I thought, here's a 4-year-old in charge of 6 million people. I don't have anything to complain about.
So truly a karmic bond.
Yes, a sort of magical, again, an inexplicable one. Then when I was a teenager, my father took me for the first time to Dharamsala, to His Holiness's house. I couldn't understand anything they were saying, but as Sonu was saying yesterday, His Holiness has a great presence, which stayed with me. So I saw him the first time he came to the US in 1979, and then as soon as Tibet opened up, I started traveling there. And these days, as I was saying, I get to travel with him every time he comes to Japan. And I think if you were to ask me what I most appreciate about the Dalai Lama, it might be that I think of him as a master realist. Because he's been leader of his people for almost 84 years. He has no interest in what-ifs, in romantic notions, in never-never lands. He has to work, very practically speaking, with the here and now. And I think sometimes the powerful charisma that Sonu was talking about and the huge heart of the Dalai Lama actually obscure, razor-sharp mind. And he's trained, as you know, for 18 years in logic and dialectics. And I think that's one of the things I've most appreciated about the Dalai Lama. And I think because he's so committed to logic and dialectics, the other thing I feel is everyone here knows our world is more poisonously divided right now than ever before. And so I appreciate a Tibetan who's not anti-Chinese. I appreciate a Buddhist who, when he travels to the West, says to people in California, please don't become a Buddhist. Stay within your own tradition where you're least likely to be deluded by romance or projection. And I'm very impressed by the fact that, as with his great friend Archbishop Desmond Tutu, or as with Pope Francis, he's always trying to learn from other traditions. He gave a long lecture, a series of lectures to a group of Christians in England on the Gospels, and tears came to his eyes when he spoke about certain of the parables of Jesus. He's called himself a defender of Islam, and as everybody knows, he's most committed to science, which really has no interest in faith. It's only grounded in the empirical. And I think in a world that's cut up by ideology more and more violently than ever before, anybody who can look over the wall and beyond his assumptions is really what we need. So I think that's one of the liberations he offers.
Pico was in a wonderful conversation in our pandemic digital series, Brave New World. It's available on the net. It's worth a view, your conversation you did with us and the Dalai Lama.
Yes, and then and on the stage in Jaipur too in 2013. That was and that speaks for one of the things that I appreciate about him. I mean, I'm not a Buddhist, so I haven't been illuminated by him as much as other people might be. But the fact that a religious figure will come to a literary festival is itself a nice development.
And he says, "I want to speak to Pico."
Well, and I want to speak to people too. I mean, he's.
No, I want to speak to Pico.
Yeah, that too. But that's less interesting than the fact that, when we travel with him in Japan, and Hiroko and I go into his hotel room every day at 8:30 in the morning. This speaks to what was happening last night. The two things I notice in his hotel room: newspaper, already well thumbed, and he listens during his first 4 hours of meditation to the BBC World Service. So he's really on top of the news. And a telescope, because he knows that wherever he goes in the world, each place will offer a different angle on the heavens. And then we'll go together in an elevator down to the hotel lobby. And of course, the word has gotten around that the Dalai Lama is in town. And as I say this, I'm remembering wonderfully, it was with the Dalai Lama in such an event I first met Vikasana Aparna in Osaka 10 or 15 years ago. So anyway, he goes down to the hotel lobby. Lots of people are there for blessings or to offer a ceremonial white scarf or to ask him a question. And a little 6-year-old girl will come up to him. And he'll listen to that girl as if he's listening to the Buddha. And the next day in Tokyo, in front of 20,000 people, he'll talk about something he's learned from that girl. And the people in the audience will think, this is part of his stump speech, this is what he says every day. But we traveling with him, see, he's genuinely, he has the gift of seeing everybody he meets as a potential illuminator of some kind.
Okay, so again, a question you've referred to this a little bit in the beginning of today's conversation, but I'm going back to this. In the half-known life, In Search of Paradise, you've written movingly of your mother, the late Nandini Iyer's illness. And in your essay on Afterworld, you write, the fact that nothing lasts is the reason why everything matters. The thought that we must die, I might have heard the 200,000 grave saying, is the reason why we must live well. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it really takes a friend and a fine reader and a fellow writer to alight. That's probably the most central sentence in that whole book. And your friend and mine, whom you brought to Jaipur, my agent, Lynn Nesbitt, said that should be the title of the book.
That's wonderful.
The reason
please congratulate her for sharp eye.
Yes, unfortunately the publishers didn't buy it, but it's a nice thought and line. I suppose it comes to us as we get older, and I was mentioning yesterday, during the pandemic, when we were living in such a state of fragility or uncertainty, I think many of us appreciated the things we otherwise sleepwalk past. And perhaps as there's less in front of you than there was behind you in the course of your life, you savor things much more. I remember when I was young, I would hear that old people are happier than the young, less confused, and of course less caught up with what they're going to do the rest of their lives. And so it's an interesting liberation that the limits that death places actually bring our attention to everything around us. On my first night here, Olivia, Willie's wife, said, paradise needs restraints. And that's actually the perfect definition of that book, and I suppose what that sentence was about.
Thank you. Now, one last question before we move to the audience. This is a question all Indian writers are very keen on, which goes back to 1993 when you published your essay in Time magazine, which was titled The Empire Strikes Back. The Empire Writes Back. which gave a name and identity tag to Indian writing in English, which was just finding its voice around that time. We had some extraordinary writing going on. Do you still manage to read and respond to writing from India and Southeast Asia in English or translated into English from the Indian, South Asian languages?
It's still some of the most exciting writing around. You know, when I was young, I spent 8 years studying nothing but literature, not a single hour of politics or history or science or other languages. It's a very narrow education in England. And I read Dickens and Chaucer and Milton, who are all wonderful things to absorb at a young age, but all dead male white writers. Literally the year after I stopped studying literature, suddenly English literature was taken over by Salman Rushdie and Kazuo Ishiguro and Ben Okri and many, many others. And Salman Rushdie bringing into English this wonderful mix of English and Hindi terms and English terms and traditions, and Amitav Ghosh bringing to Egypt the kind of eye perhaps only somebody from a similar developing country could bring, and Vikram writing Jane Austen at a space of 1,370 pages, and writing Pushkin stanza-length novel about California. Arundhati Roy essentially remaking the landscape with Goddess of Small Things. So it was really, really exciting. I was thinking how at this gathering there were 2 Booker Prize winners, and one is from South Africa and one is sort of from Australia. And the exciting thing that was happening in the 1980s was that suddenly the Booker Prize wasn't being claimed by writers from London or New York, but from Sri Lanka and Pakistan and Nigeria and everywhere else. And I think that's what's made our lives, our conversations, our relationships, our food, our music so much more interesting. There are several people at this festival who attended the same high school penitentiary as I in Berkshire, in England. And I remember when I was there were 1,250 boys, all boys, of course, and 3 of us had dark skins. And even Jewish and Catholic boys were so extraordinary. I think there were 15 of them out of 1,250. And of course, now when I go back, every other kid there is Indian and Korean and Russian, and a wonderful mix of the two. And I think we sometimes overlook the fact that the world has become so much more interesting in the process, as has our literature, because it's as if English literature, which is a rather stuffy old Miss Havisham house, suddenly had its doors and windows thrown open to admit new stories, new histories, new ways of telling stories, spices, sounds, rhythms we'd never really heard before. And in many ways, I think this is a golden age of writing. And I know you were, as an anthologist and especially as a writer, at the center of the revolution that Indian fiction has brought to the world. But now I'm so impressed by Indian non-fiction that somebody like Anjan Sundaram is bringing to me Congo and Central African Republic that I never get to read about from other writers. I mention in my most recent book, Saman Subramanian's book about Sri Lanka, this divided island, dazzling reportage. I mean, more than world class. Basharat Peer gives us Kashmir from the Kashmiri point of view, not the kind of thing we could easily imagine 70 years ago. So on every front, and that's just, as you said, the South Asian example, but you could do the same with African writing in English and every other kind.
So before, I know intuitively, counterintuitively, lot of very good questions waiting, but one last question to you. Have you been translated into Japanese? How does it fare there?
A little bit. The curious thing is, when I wrote my last book about impermanence in Japan, which was that line that you quoted, that the fact that nothing lasts is why we enjoy it, if the cherry blossoms were there all year, nobody would go out to see them. It's the fact they last for 10 years that makes them so precious. So I wrote a book about my neighborhood and playing ping pong with my neighbors. A Japanese publisher very quickly asked to translate it, and I actually said no, because I thought it would make my neighbors uncomfortable if they knew that there was somebody spying on them and secretly taking notes and recording, not exactly their secrets, but their daily lives. So in a curious way, I'm very happy in that way to be an outsider in Japan. My nickname in the neighborhood is Isoro, which means parasite, because I'm the only male in the neighborhood who doesn't put on a suit and tie and go to the office at 6 in the morning. I'm slouching around in my pajamas while my poor wife is going off to work. So I'm happy to be a sort of negligible tourist there. Yes.
So I think we are ready. I think there's a question from Navtej Sarna. Can somebody get the mic to him? Hello. Navtej is sitting in the corner there.
Thank you, Pico. As usual, wonderful conversation. Thanks to Namita. Just one, in your search for paradise, what value would you put on somebody both of us admire hugely, on your engagement with Leonard Cohen, which you've written about? You're meeting him. Did his approach to life, his detachment, his meditative style impact your search, your writing in any way?
In too many ways to count. And we spoke a little bit yesterday on this stage about how he made himself invisible in the monastery. And he said, just sitting there day after day after day for 1,800 days was the richest adventure that he could imagine, the most voluptuous excitement that the world had to offer in his characteristic ways. And it reminded me how many of you have been to Japan. If I go to a temple down the street in Kyoto, often written on the ground in Japanese at the entrance are the words, "Look beneath your feet." In other words, paradise is not in some never land in the future. It's not some golden age in the past. This is where we have to claim it, as I said before. And I think that's very much the truth that he was living. I think as a writer, I gained a huge amount from somebody who would spend 12 years working on a song with maybe 3 verses. No shortcuts in writing. And he would just sit and sit and sit until he had found the truest and most unexpected word. There's recently been a film about his song Hallelujah, which highlights what I saw in his little cabin in the temple, which is 80 books with different verses for Hallelujah that finally he distilled into 4 and later recorded 6 in all. But I suppose it speaks to that Japanese aesthetic that the fewer things you have in the room, the more attention you bring to anyone. And I probably grew up, because my blood is entirely Indian, with a sort of maximalist notion of putting as much as possible into every page. And when I wrote my first book, Video Night in Kathmandu, you're almost kind of saturated with more details than you know what to do with. And the longer I've been in Japan, probably the more I've moved to what Leonard was doing, which is clearing everything out, taking 1,000 details and reducing them to 2, so that when you go into a Japanese tea house room, there's nothing there but a scroll and a vase of flowers. And if you bring all your attention to them, you find the whole world in there and much more. I was really moved by his graciousness, his humility, and his gift for silence. And I don't think I've acquired any of those, but they're things to learn from. I was telling a couple of new friends the other day, when I would visit him in his house, and he lived in a very modest house in a really beaten-up part of Los Angeles, where there were bars on the windows, and the pizza places wouldn't deliver because it was so dangerous. And he shared that with his daughter. And I'd go and have lunch with him, and at the end of lunch, he'd sometimes take 2 folding chairs, and he'd bring them out to the little garden in front of a bed of flowers. We'd sit there, as Namita and I are sitting. We'd sit and we'd sit and we'd sit. Nothing. Nothing. Minute after minute after minute. 20 minutes, absolute silence. And I remember the first time I thought, well, this is a gentle hint. And I'd say to him, excuse me, you must be very busy, I should leave. He said, please, don't go. And he realized that silence was the deepest form of intimacy and trust, and in some ways, much richer form of friendship than he could share with me with chatter. And given he was the most eloquent writer I've ever met, the fact that he could do without words was a remarkable and humbling thing for me. So, his name within the monastery was Jikan, which is the silence between 2 thoughts. And insofar as Leonard Cohen inhabited that silence lifelong for his last, 26 years, 21 years, that was something any writer could learn from. And I think it's one of the reasons I went to Japan. The deeper the silence, the fewer the words you need. And I was talking recently to Shekhar yesterday about Ozu movies. And the beauty of them is all the conversation is absolutely banal. And nothing is happening on the surface, which means everything is happening under the surface. And they're more captivating than any Marvel movie that I could imagine.
That was the most beautiful answer. I think you need a clap just for silence. Now, do we have time for more questions, Judith? One more. Last question.
I'm here. Hi.
Hi.
Yes.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you so much for this lovely conversation. I wanted to ask you, very often we have the tendency to define ourselves in relation to an other, to a sense of an otherness. I am what I am because I know that the other is whatever it is. And you also know that opposites are complementary. So you are in search of paradise. I wanted to know, Do you know what your hell is? Or do you have a definition of what your hell is? Or how would you define hell?
Confusion. I mean, hell could only be internal. I remember in the movie 21 Grams, Benicio del Toro is sitting there, and he says what I think you read in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, too. You know, hell is here, nowhere other than that. And I think that's what the stillness thing is about. Although I don't practice meditation, I don't have any religious life as such. I feel the clearer my mind is, the happier the people around me will be, and probably the happier I will be. And the more I'm racing from place to place and unable to process experience, the more I'll be in a hell that I'll be spreading to everybody I meet that day. And I think you and I met walking along the beach at 6:30 2 days ago. And you clearly have already figured this out, because there were only 3 of us on the beach that day. And I thought we all have found that if you can spend a little time in the beginning of the morning in that absolute silence, the rest of the day will take care of itself, and that hell becomes a notion you can't even entertain anymore. It's hard enough to think of hell in Soneva Fushi, but even more so if you can gather yourself quietly.
I think we close this session, and thank you for being here, and thank you for this absolutely very a conversation that left me feeling happy and light and clear. Thank you.
Thank you, and really I want to thank you and Sanjay and Willie and everybody for inviting us again and again to be part of your family. Hiroko every day this week has been saying, arigato, arigato, and I said, thank our amazing hosts at Soneva Fushi and at JLF. So thank you all.
You.